everyone, and welcome back to American Government. So today we're going to move into Chapter 2 and talk a little bit about the politics of the founding. So where do our originating principles come from? What was the basis for the Declaration of Independence? We hinted at it a little bit in Chapter 1, but let's move forward and look at it a little bit more closely. So first thing to think about is, why did people come from Europe, predominantly Great Britain, looking at our founding fathers? Why did they come to what was then called the New World? Well, colonists left England for a lot of reasons. We often hear about religious freedom when we think about Thanksgiving. To escape feudalism, so at this point in time it would have been very difficult if you did not already come from a family with land to acquire land in Britain, or for just economic opportunities in general. So maybe you're the youngest of 7 brothers and you do have a family with land, but you won't get very much being the very youngest. So when we think about this, there are a diverse set of reasons. But in terms of why we then revolted, I think it's important that we look most closely at the economic reasons. So what were the economic reasons that the colonists rebelled against England? Well, let's do a little bit of background here. During this time, you have what again is called the New World, and it's contested territory. France is trying to lay claims, especially to the areas in what's now Canada, and so is England. Meanwhile, you have an indigenous population, the Native Americans, who also clearly have a claim to the land. The French and Indian War marks a time in which England had to spend considerable resources to maintain their claim to territories in what is now the United States. And after this war, England taxed the colonies to cover all of the costs of the wars. Colonists were not very appreciative of this. While it was lovely to have safety, they didn't have any say in how they would be taxed, what the burden of tax would be on the colonies versus the motherland, and how exactly to fight the war was out of their control as well. So colonists didn't really like not having any representation, but paying for all of the decisions. How did the rebellion actually get started then? Well, you don't just go straight from "I'm angry about taxes" to a revolution. So there's some intermediary steps. We have citizens joining together to form the Sons of Liberty. Keep in mind the very limited role that women would have been able to have in political sphere, in the public sphere in general at this point in time. So we have citizens joining together to form the Sons of Liberty, really emphasizing the notion we talked about before about Lockean ideas of liberty and Hobbesian ideas of liberty. Now, when we hear about the Sons of Liberty, it's often in our collective narrative thought about in terms of this everyday man joining up with the Sons of Liberty to start a new country. In reality, the organizers of the revolution were really upper-class people, those who were most impacted by the changes in the taxes. This is not terribly surprising. That said, were there Sons of Liberty, or at least those acting on behalf of Sons of Liberty from the lower classes? Sure. But they certainly weren't orchestrating things. From the beginning of this country, we were pretty elitist. So in 1774, we get the First Continental Congress, and this is where you have that elite group of Sons of Liberty meeting in Philadelphia to think about how do we either restore peace or full-on revolt. And at this First Continental Congress, the preference was for restoring peace, not forming a new nation. That said, the discussions at this First Continental Congress would be the precursors to what eventually would end up in the Declaration of Independence and subsequently the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Now, in 1774, they're talking about let's restore peace, but by early 1775, peace is no longer looking like a very feasible option. We've got fighting starting in Massachusetts with the occupation of Boston Harbor and Boston as a city, and the Second Continental Congress convenes. This is where they make the full-on break. It's time to actually separate from England. So they declare independence officially the following year, 1776. The Declaration of Independence was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, and he really bases this on Lockean ideas of the social contract. So the reason that the colonists had the right to rebel was because Britain, and specifically the king and parliament, had violated the social contract. Now, just to refresh, social contract theory says that people have the right to be ruled in the ways that they choose, essentially. So if I agree to the rules of the government and give up some of my autonomy in the interest of having a government. But if that government is doing things that do not really accord with what I see as the government's role, rights, responsibilities, and that's true on a massive scale, then the people collectively have a right to throw those rulers out and set new rulers in. Well, why did they need to make this broader case? Why not just say, okay, we're done with England, we don't want to be a part of you anymore? Keep in mind that at this point in time, England is what we would now think about in terms of superpowers, right? And in that context, they didn't stand much of a chance unless they could get help from outside of the colonies. They needed other countries to support their revolution. One way to do this was to establish a principle that would allow countries like France and Spain to support their rebellion while not implying that a rebellion should happen in their own countries or their own colonies. Now, you declare independence, but then that leaves a vacuum. What do we have in place to set the rules? What institutions should exist instead now that we're getting rid of the old ones? So one of the first things, and we talked about this a little bit before, was that the members of the Continental Congress decided that the new nation should be a republic. Now, some key features of a republic, again, are that it is a representative democracy and that the leader is also part of this democratic process, so there will not be a monarch. This is an important break from the British legacy that was the home for many of the colonists prior to immigrating. The idea that the person in charge should be chosen by the people as opposed to divinely sought by God or out of right of heritage or birth is a huge break. So the Second Continental Congress develops these Articles of Confederation. This is really the precursor to our Constitution and in some ways a practice round. There were some things that did not go super well with the Articles of Confederation. We'll come back to that in a minute. But what I want you to think about before we move on is the way in which we talk about revolution, right? Thomas Jefferson justified the revolution using social contract theory. In today's language, we often hear organizations like the Tea Party hearkening to the revolution, right? It's explicitly a reference to the Boston Tea Party. But are they making a similar kind of argument? Are they relying on social contract theory or something else? So take a minute, look at what they think their main ideas are versus how NPR juxtaposes the Tea Party of today versus the Tea Party of yesteryear.